Well, good morning again and welcome back to the quiet place, that place where we come to draw close to God just as Jesus did, to meet with his Father, to be refreshed, encouraged and commissioned for the day. And hopefully you've been coming with us on this journey. We're almost at the end, and this time we're looking at chapter 20, and there are some great truths here as well as some funny moments too. Things like verse 2. Let me read that. Mary ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and she said, "They've taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." John reminds us how he was the one who Jesus loved. It just made me laugh how he kind of refers to himself in that way, just so we all know. And equally funny for me, I think, is verse 4, when John says, Peter and the other disciple, referring to himself, started out for the tomb. They were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. I just couldn't stop laughing when I read that. Of course, as I've said, he was the other disciple. And let's say, just how competitive were they? Think about the context. Jesus has died. They're in shock. And yet, even with the news from Mary, Peter and John are still wanting to know who's the greatest, or in this case, who was the fastest. And John, at one level, is trying to act with humility and not naming himself, but on the other hand, still wants to point out that this unnamed disciple, who Jesus loved, the other disciple, him, was still the fastest. It just cracked me up. Anyway, maybe that's just my sense of humour, but it did make me laugh. However, we shouldn't laugh too much, because even though John continues to refer to himself in this secretive way, verses 8 and 9 give us an insight as to why he ends up writing this whole gospel account. John 20:8 and 9. Now the disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and he believed. For until then they still hadn't understood the scriptures that said Jesus must rise from the dead. Now, before this chapter ends, John will tell us exactly why he wrote it, but these verses are a bit of a catalyst. So let's consider what's been going on in all this running and frantic action. There is a moment when the penny drops and John believes that Jesus may have actually been raised from the dead. Maybe Peter did too. But they then do something weird, or I think's weird. Verse 10, it says they went home. So in verse 4, when Peter and John heard about the empty tomb, they were both running. And then verse 10, on seeing the empty tomb, they went home. I guess crisis hit, an emergency happened, and suddenly there was lots of frantic activity, lots of running, lots of racing about. Mary initially ran to get the disciples, but then in verse 11 we read that she stopped. Verse 11, Mary was standing outside the tomb crying, and as she wept, she stopped and looked in. She stopped and looked in. It would seem that Peter and John ran there, had a quick squiz around, and then went home, but Mary stopped. In her grief, she stopped. She slowed down and she looked in. It was once that she'd said no to hurry, no to the frantic demands of the crisis, and stopped, that she encountered angels. And then as we read on, we read that she then encountered the risen Jesus, all because she stopped long enough for an encounter. Her stopping allowed angels to minister to her in her grief and pain. I wonder how often we miss receiving the ministry of angels because we never stop long enough. Her stopping gave time for Jesus to reveal himself to her and to reveal his plans. I think sometimes we don't stop long enough to see Jesus and recognise who he is or hear his plan for the moment. There's a message and a stark warning for us here that we should learn to stop and look in, as Mary did here in the tomb. Stop long enough to allow angels to minister and Jesus to reveal himself and his plans for you. Actually, there's more here about making time to stop, not just to hear Jesus, but to hear the testimony of others as well, and to believe. You know, we read a little bit later on when Jesus appears after his resurrection in John 20:29. It says, "Then Jesus told him, 'You believe because you've seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me.'" Now, let's move on towards the end of the chapter, verses 31, 31 really, but we'll start in 30. The disciples saw Jesus do many miraculous signs in addition to the ones recorded in this book. But these are written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing in him, you will have life by the power of his name. As I said earlier, and we read verse 8, John had that lights on moment when he believed. And now here in verse 31, he declares that he is writing all this down so that others might believe too. This is why this book of the Bible I love, and I always recommend it to those people who are inquiring about Jesus. I always say, read this because it's been written so that those who read it might believe. So I guess my message today is twofold. First, say no to hurry. Stop racing around and reacting to everything. Stop. Take some time to look in. Time for angels to minister to you, and time for Jesus to reveal himself and his plans for you. And secondly, when you tell someone about Jesus today, tell them to look up St. John's Gospel on the internet. Give it to them to read because it's been written that they might believe. Amen. Wonderful. Well, have a great day. And as always, don't forget to tell someone about Jesus. Amen. Bless you.